After many months of delays, U.S. F-16 aircraft are now close to being introduced into combat in the Russia-Ukraine war, and that is going to change the tide of war. It's going to be a game changer and turn things around. The Ukraine side has chosen a new strategy where they're going to try to hold in 2024 and be ready for an offensive in 2025, when especially as those F-16s come by in a little bit higher numbers, things on the battlefield will finally start turning in the way of the Ukraine side. Not really. No, I'm kidding. That's the popular narrative. That's what all the headlines are saying these days, and that's what so many so-called experts are telling everybody on the television, print media, social media. You keep hearing all this about the F-16 is going to be a game changer, about how that's going to finally show it, because it's going to be those modern American weapons, and that above everything is finally going to change the reality on the ground. There's just no truth to it, folks. There is no truth to that at all. The application of F-16s are going to have an impact, because, I mean, if you don't have something like that and now all of a sudden you have it, you can use it. But the idea that that's going to be a game changer is belied by the reality on the ground, belied by combat reality, how air power works, how it works in conjunction with ground power and in conjunction with the dynamics of the balance of power between the opposing forces. All of those things just ridicule such a thought here. But we see a continuing and, for me, disturbing trend that we have our leaders seem to keep following that same kind of path, and this detachment from reality and this enthusiastically pushing things that just aren't so. So, as always, I'm not just going to make claims. I'm going to back it up with solid evidence so that you can see that this is, in fact, the reality on the ground. So, first of all, let's take a look, because Zelensky yesterday was in, I believe it was Holland, and was talking about how, you know what, these planes are coming.
The Netherlands is actively helping us with air defense, with the F-16 coalition. This year, new fighter jets will be in our skies, and we have to make this year an effective one in defending ourselves against Russian-guided bombs, Russian aircraft, and their missiles.
Now, if you're not completely familiar with what's going on with this process of F-16s, here's a bit of a short briefing that shows what they're doing and what the Ukrainian pilots are preparing to do.
Despite harsh weather, time shortage, and the pressure to return to the fight, Ukrainian pilots and technicians are going through intense training at the Skrydstrup base in Denmark. The F-16 is highly complex. Ukraine has never had access to such an advanced system. It's an immense challenge for the technicians who will be responsible for the jet's maintenance. For Ukraine, the F-16 is crucial, especially now, as Russia is intensifying its attacks. With the F-16, the pilots will keep enemy aviation from Ukraine's borders, minimizing the threat of glide bombs on civilians and soldiers alike. The F-16s will make Ukraine stronger, and Ukraine is grateful to the coalition for coming together to help Ukraine secure its sky.
Now, the reason for these airplanes, and at least what Zelensky's plan is because he thinks that they're going to get ready for an offensive. Now, that Politico suggested that they're going to try to hold the rest of this year. And again, we're just in February, folks, and they're already talking about sometime in 2025 before we're going to get ready for this. But Zelensky's saying, no, we are going to go on an offensive, as he told Brett Baer on Fox News just a few days ago.
To continue our successful story on the Black Sea, and we will do it. I will not now go deeply to details, but they will get some surprises. I mean, Russians. Yeah, that's very important. So South is very important to defend East, where they have more than 200,000 soldiers, also very important to defend. And of course, we will prepare new counteroffensive, new operation. And of course, it's not, I'm not speaking that we will just stay. Of course, it depends on a lot of things.
You know, you always pay a lot of attention to body language, and I couldn't help but notice when he was talking, he had been looking at Brett Baer the whole time, and when he started saying that they're going to go on an offensive, he kind of looked away like, we're going to go on an offensive. You know, the classic thing when you break eye contact when you're saying something you know is not really accurate. We'll take that for whatever it's worth. But whether he intended that or not, that certainly is the case, reality. And let's take a look at those F-16s for a second. So there was an article here a couple of days ago that talked about how the F-16s are a diva of aircraft because they're very, very hard to operate. You have to have very specific specifications on the type of runways that they have. They can't just use a regular runway like some of the MiG-29s that they have or the Su-24s. that are the mainstays of the Ukrainian Air Force. They have to have substantial tender loving care in some case, which is why they get that diva tag, because the maintenance has to be, requirements are so high, and you have to have a lot of highly trained experts with all of the supply parts that you need, things that you need to keep the diagnostics going on, ways to keep the plane in the air. You've got to have people that know what they're looking for, folks. Those are hard to do. That's not something you just, shop out to somebody else or just create in a couple of months and think you're going to have it. I mean, you have institutional knowledge in the U.S. to keep our planes flying. And sometimes, as you see, sometimes even that runs into some trouble. But the idea that the Ukraine side is going to get this up and running in a short period of time, probably not going to happen. There was another article out that was talking from the Secretary of the Air Force, where they said that the first aircraft, F-16s, are on track, which was earlier last month, I guess. But there's an interesting call out from that article where they say that the U.S. and its allies expect Ukrainian Air Force to achieve initial operating capacity with its F-16s by the end of 2024, according to Assistant Secretary of Defense for Internal Security Affairs, Celeste Wallander, who said the pilot training was, quote, on track. And that should tell you something. And by the way, in some other reporting, we find out that when they're on track, that means 12 pilots by the end of the year. Maybe they get up to 30, 40 aircraft. And it seems like, okay, well, that sounds like a good raw number, 30 or 40 aircraft. So by the end of the year, they might get 12. And then maybe later on in 2025, perhaps maybe they can get up to 40. But that's a big if. And look, folks, let me just explain some things to you about the F-16. U.S. pilots, they spend somewhere around 3 years in preparation and training, learning just how to fly, and then actually getting in, and doing combat operations training specifically so that you can do air-to-air, air-to-ground, all the things that are necessary. 3 years before we consider them ready. And now then we're doing accelerated training for the F-16 pilots. And folks, look, we've talked about this in a different capacity. And if you looked at any of the things that I had written prior to the summer offensive last year, one of the things I highlighted is a major problem with the attempt to have an offensive in the summer of last year was the fact that they didn't have sufficient time to train. They needed much, much more time to train. I argued they needed a full 12 months, ideally 18 months as a cohort, as a unit, large units, to be able to do training to give them a legitimate shot in doing modern combat combined arms operations. Instead, they accelerated this training and spent literally a few weeks and not at the large level. And then they ran into the expected, failure in the field when they fought. F-16s are going to be no different. In fact, it might even be worse if you have high hopes and expectations that this is going to work, because you see we have an existing program. All the Western Air Forces have a similar type of program for their pilots. They take years. Now, you try to compress that and accelerate it in combat and then send it into an Air Force where they do have trained pilots and where they do have solid air defense. And you see, you're setting them up for failure. One of the little recognized problems with the Ukraine side here is if you just took somebody from scratch and trained him up, and how to fly and everything in the F-16 from the beginning, you'd have a better shot than taking these existing MiG-29s. And it seems counterintuitive because you're like, well, if you can fly this fighter aircraft, we'll just learn how to fly this different. And it's like, you can drive a BMW, and now instead we're going to learn how to fly or drive a Mercedes or something like that. So just one to the other, but they're both vehicles. No, because this Soviet way of fighting and training was very different. So you have to get that mentality out of your head into the new mentality of how to operate this aircraft, because it's very different operating systems and mentality of how to fight, and you can't just interchange them. So it's actually harder than it may seem to take an experienced MiG-28 to 29 pilot. But no one's talking about those things. No one's considering those things, and they're still going to rush them to get them to the battlefield as soon as possible. And I think that as they did on the ground, all you're going to do is rush to failure. Because the other thing that doesn't get talked about a lot, okay, so maybe they get 40 planes sometime in 2025, 40 F-16s. You realize that right now, the entirety of the Ukrainian Air Force is 78 combat aircraft. Whether they're all operational at any one time is a separate issue, but they have that many, 78. The Russians have just under 1,200 combat aircraft. You've heard a lot of in the news, perhaps recent days, that the Russian side has lost 10 aircraft in the last less than 2 weeks, and that seems a good number. And obviously, it's a good thing from the Ukraine side if you get any, but 10 seems like a high number. Problem is, the reason why they've taken down so many is because Russia's flying them in a lot higher numbers, which is having a devastating effect on the front lines. And that's one of the big reasons why it's now starting to move to the west on the ground, because Russia has those pilots. They still have a capacity to make new planes, although it's a very slow process. They can afford those losses because they have a big starting pile of them, and they have a ability to make some more underneath it. The Ukraine side, they don't have that. It's not surprising that when we gave them the M1 tanks, that you never saw them used at all until only very recently, even though it was well over a year ago that we gave them. We only gave them 31, first of all, which is one battalion, which is a drop in the bucket in comparison with the hundreds of tanks that they have in their inventory. And you see that they were afraid to even use them. We didn't want them to use them. The Brits didn't want them to use their Challengers because they don't want them to be showing up, as now did happen a week or so ago with the first M1 that was seen destroyed on the battlefield. That's one. The rest of them haven't even been seen actually in combat. The same will be the true for the F-16s. The last thing the West wants, the United States wants, is footage of F-16s, flaming out and hitting the ground, and wreckage on the ground, et cetera, or failing in combat. So there's going to be a real reluctance to the U.S. to even allow them to be used. We'll see how it plans out. We'll see if they want this to drag out and not even use them. That's entirely possible. But what's important to understand here categorically and fundamentally is that this is the latest in the inability or unwillingness of the Ukrainian side and the Western leaders to accept and acknowledge just basic reality. And unfortunately, this is not anything that we haven't seen in a long time. And it's been on display in other areas beyond the F-16. So a few days ago, you may have seen a big dust up about a comment made by French President Macron implying that French troops could end up in the fight.
Macron said while no consensus was reached on deployment, France could not rule out a potential later need for it to ensure Russia does not win the war.
We should not exclude that there might be a need for security, which then justifies some elements of deployment. But I've told you very clearly what France maintains as its position, which is strategic ambiguity that I stand by. Nothing should be excluded to pursue our goals.
Now, this touched off a firestorm actually within the alliance, and apparently some animosity that's been building up between the heads of state of France, UK, and Germany. And Chancellor Olaf Scholz went on publicly and said, no, we're not going to go. We're not sending any German troops into Ukraine. I can assure you that. We're not going to give them our long-range missile, the Taurus, because that would require German soldiers to go into the fight to help the Ukraine side fire them into Russia, like the Germans, like the French and the UK are doing with theirs. So he threw them under the bus and admitted that, yeah, there are Western soldiers on the ground helping the Ukraine side directly engage Russian soldiers, which obviously has touched off a firestorm. And then someone, don't know who yet, leaked that actually Germans have been helping, despite what Scholz said. They already have been doing something similar with some of their equipment as well. And then there was another, someone released footage or radio intercepts of a telephone conversation with German troops, German generals, talking about how they want to help the Ukraine side blow up the Kerch Bridge in the Crimea area there. So now then you're seeing the West throw rocks back and forth with itself as they're trying to put on this unified front, which is obviously not helping anyone here. But this is obviously going to have a response out of Russia, out of Moscow. You can't talk about some other country using their troops to attack your country and killing your soldiers and not do something about it. Now, a couple of days ago, we had Doug McGregor on our show, and we were talking about this issue, and he pointed out he thought that Vladimir Putin would see this stuff, but he hopes that he'll have a measured approach to it. If the Russians see the Western nations doing this, putting all this money in killing their troops, I mean, at some point they're going to say it's stupid for us not to get ready for that outcome. And of course, then you have this mutually building fear of each other. And that's what leads to a lot of wars. And so we're going down a path right now that our foolish actions here could lead us into catastrophe.
No, I think so, but I also think Mr. Putin is a rational man. He's never wanted any of this. He really wants to get back to some sort of state of normalcy with the West and do business. But as you say, he has to respond to what he sees develop. Right now, we have Americans moving in to create bases in northern Finland and Sweden. We've destroyed decades of trust and mutual confidence, replaced all of it with mutual suspicion, fear, and distrust.
And how is that mutual fear and distrust manifesting itself? Because as Doug suggested, Putin is going to have to do something. He can't literally take no action or make any comments. So a couple of days ago, Putin went on national television in Russia and said this.
They should eventually understand that we also have weapons, and they know it. I just said it now myself, weapons that can hit targets on their territory. Everything that the West is coming up with now, what they threaten the world with, it can result in a conflict with the use of nuclear weapons, and therefore the destruction of civilization.
Pretty strong words there. Now, I heard a video just yesterday, or maybe it was even this morning. No, it was last night. Ben Hodges went on CNN and said, when asked about Putin's commentary, he said, I wouldn't worry much about that. I mean, he's just bluster. You can't dismiss it, he said, but it's not really that serious because, he's not going to do that because he knows the consequences on him. Fair enough that Putin does know the consequences of using that. But folks, let's consider who we're talking about here. Now, we love to talk about how Putin is an evil guy and a modern day Hitler and a dictator, all that kind of stuff, because we love to characterize them as being thoughtless kinds of just evil people, because that makes it easy. You don't have to actually listen to him. Even if that were true, you better listen to him and you better understand who you're dealing with, because Putin is not one to casually throw around threats. I'm going to show you a small clip of an exchange he had about 2 weeks before the war started in February 2022, where he laid out his rationale, why he's doing things, and what's going to happen if the outcome doesn't change in terms of NATO and Ukraine. Notice what he says in light of how things have passed since that time.
Our actions will depend not on the negotiations, but on the unconditional security of Russia today and in the future. In this regard, we have made it absolutely clear that NATO's expansion to the east is unacceptable. What's not clear about it? We are not the ones that deploy missiles next to the United States borders. That's the other way around. The United States brought their missiles next to our borders. They are at our threshold. Are we excessive in our demands not to put any more offensive weapons next to our home? What's so unusual about this request? So NATO is expanding, and so now they're in Poland, so they have the offensive weapons in there. That's what I'm talking about. We are not the ones who are threatening someone. We are not the ones who came to the border of the US or the UK. They came to us. And now they're saying, no, now we will have Ukraine as well. It means they will deploy their weapons there. Even if not officially part of NATO, if they have some agreements, they will have their bases and they will have their weapons in there. That's what we're talking about. And you want guarantees from me. You should come up with guarantees right now, immediately.
So he was very clear that NATO and Ukraine was a red line. He had at that time around 200,000 troops surrounding Ukraine, made it very clear that he was ready to strike. We know subsequently from General Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO Stoltenberg, that after this speech and sometime before February, that Putin said, hey, declare Ukraine as neutral and there's not going to be any fight. And Stoltenberg not only refused that, but then went out and I think around the same time, he very publicly, emphatically claimed, nobody tells us who's coming into NATO. That door will stay open for both Ukraine and Georgia, no matter what. And then Putin acted on it. So he told you where his red lines were. We crossed the red lines, or we emphatically said we were in the direction of moving, and then he did act. So do you really want to trust that Putin is not going to be a man of his word this time, that he would allow his forces to be driven out of the country, or he would allow NATO countries to come and help fight against his troops and it not end up there? Folks, that's a bad gamble. That's a gamble. That's not even a positive risk. But what it does is it shows that even though we see that Putin actually means some of these things that he says, even though he's acted on them, even though he's been talking about this, if you watched our video from yesterday, since 2007 in public, he's been giving you warning after warning that this is on his border is something he cannot comprehend and cannot contain. He will not allow it to happen, as we wouldn't. I assure you, if something similar was happening in Mexico or Canada, if they were going to make an alliance with, say, China, for example, and Chinese military were going to be on our borders, hell no, that's not going to happen. We're not going to allow that. So I don't know why we think that it would be different for another nuclear power to do the same thing. And even though we see this disaster on the ground, even though we see all of these things like the F-16 is not going to be a miracle weapon, just like the tank wasn't, M1 wasn't a miracle weapon, the Challenger, the Patriot air system, none of those things have been game changers, even though all of them were claimed that they would be. They aren't, and they're not going to be, because it's not about machines, it's about men. It's not about money, it's about men and manpower. And all of those things, as I keep telling you, are decisively on the side of Russia and growing by the day on the conventional level. And instead of recognizing the truth, we keep going on with this myth and this fiction that actually, no, things are going to work out okay. We are going to defeat Russia. Think I'm exaggerating? Let's take a look at some of the highest ranking American officials in just recent days and a couple of weeks ago that reiterate how foolish what they are in light of the ground truth reality. We'll start with, I believe it's Deputy Secretary of State Victoria Nuland.
Without sending a single U.S. soldier into combat and investing less than 1/10 of 1 year's defense budget of the United States, we have helped Ukraine destroy 50% of Russia's ground combat power, 50%, and 20% of its vaunted Black Sea fleet. Ukraine has taken off the battlefield 21 naval ships, 102 Russian aircraft, and 2,700 Russian tanks. By every measure, Ukraine's bravery and strength, its resilience, has made the United States safer.
Okay, that is just grossly inaccurate. It has not made America safer. And it's also deceptive to claim that we have destroyed 50% of the Russia's equipment. Okay, there has been a lot of Russian equipment destroyed in every category that you want to mention. But what she's not even mentioning, a couple of things she's not even mentioning, is that the Russian industry is now cranking into high gear. So now they're making lots of stuff they didn't even make in any kind of numbers before the war, especially in multiple categories of drone warfare, FPV drones, attack drones, reconnaissance drones, all kinds of stuff. Anti-drone capacity, electronic warfare capacity has now expanded well beyond what it was before, and it's obviously having a significant effect on the front line. Their industry itself is creating now large-scale weapons, large-scale numbers of 152 millimeter artillery shells, which their howitzers use. And so there's a disparity, a huge disparity at the front, and it's only going to grow regardless of what the U.S. Congress does or doesn't do. That's not going to change that disparity. It's huge. And she's just not telling you that. She's also not mentioning the other side of that, the catastrophic losses that the Ukraine side has had, the fact they don't have indigenous industry at scale that can even ever hope to catch up to, much less excel beyond what the Russians are going to do. She doesn't even mention that. And then all these Ukrainian people who are dying, and she rolls this back to saying, this is actually helping America and keeping us safer. That's just absurd. How do you want to say that making Russia stronger, bigger, more capacity, and filling them with hatred toward the West is going to make us safer? It's going to do the exact opposite. The idea that we're going to go in and win and defeat the Russians is impossible. Not unlikely, impossible. Because there is zero chance, and Russian officials have said this from the beginning, if you ever start to drive Russian conventionally out of those areas, even the theoretical possibility that someday, 2025, 26, 27, fill in the blank, that somehow the Ukraine side would muster the forces and the capacity to start driving Russia out, they're going to use nuclear weapons. There's not even a chance, zero chance, that Putin would allow his forces to be driven from the field, especially in areas they've annexed and now consider Russian territory, and even especially, most pointedly, Crimea, without using nuclear weapons. You're delusional. And anyone who says otherwise is outright delusional. I will use that strong language because it's accurate. But American and other officials are kind of in this same boat, in this just unwillingness to recognize gross levels of information of reality on the ground, like the National Security Advisor.
Of course, Ukraine can win. Of course, Ukraine has already succeeded militarily in one of the most profound objectives it had, which was to keep the country from falling into Russian hands. It has already done that. And Ukraine can go further in retaking territory that Russia has occupied.
Okay, if it was just him, that's one thing. But you see the emphatic way that he says that, well, of course, Ukraine's going to win. I mean, even if you are the most optimistic, the best you could ever say, given the last 2 years of history and all of the fundamentals I've just laid out for you, you could say, well, if things fall the right way, Ukraine still has a chance or something like that. But to just categorically and flippantly say, well, of course they're going to win. It's obvious. I mean, that is so detached from reality and should alarm us all. When the National Security Advisor of the United States, who gives advice to the president, is so detached from actual reality, and if the president listens to actions that keep moving us in a direction that increases the chance of a nuclear miscalculation, which could move this into a new level that would be catastrophic for all of mankind, not just our own national security, there has to be we have to recognize there's a big problem there. Now, it's fair, though, to say, where does he get his marching orders from? Because his boss, well, you can see for yourself.
We have to stand up to Putin and pass the national bipartisan bill, the National Security Bill, supporting Ukraine as they defend themselves against Putin's vicious onslaught, and prove to the world once more America can be relied on. We stand strong with our allies. We have to remember who we are. We're the United States of America. We keep our commitments. We never walk away from our friends. And we sure as hell don't bow down to Vladimir Putin.
Oh, you see there that's a campaign commercial, basically, and it literally is made like one. And it's just a bunch of bumper stickers and forceful comments that are totally detached from reality. There's almost nothing accurate about what he said there. And again, this implication that something decisive is about this $60 billion he's trying to wrest out of the Congress is going to somehow make a difference on the battlefield. Folks, most people don't even know what that money's going for. Now, you'll have people like Victoria Nuland and Secretary of State talk about how it's going into American defense contractors. Yay, money. Okay, that's not going to change the dynamics on the battlefield. Even at the best, it's going to allow a few more artillery shells to be matched, but it won't even come close at the absolute highest capacity to change the dynamics of the Russian side, which is building up its arsenal of artillery shells faster than, like 4 or 5 times faster than anything the West is going to do with or without that Congress bill. It will not make a difference. So if you're thinking that that's all we're waiting on and that's going to change it, the latest game changer, man, folks, you're in for anyone who believes that's in for a hard fall, because that's what's going to happen. This is not going to result in a win. And it is time. It is way past time to say, listen, let's do something that does make sense. Let's do something that does result in the security of America. And that is end this war as soon as possible. Recognizing that we have our nuclear arsenal, we have our armed forces, we have Article 5 and all of NATO, and should Putin ever act against that, we have overwhelming conventional and nuclear firepower to defend ourselves. Putin has shown, whether he's evil or not, and he does a lot of things, and there's no question that he's ordered lots of people to be assassinated and murdered, so he's a terrible person, but he is also a rational actor for his interests in his country. He has plainly said what his red lines are and where he'll act and where his security lies. And if there's no threat, if there's nobody trying to put NATO into the country on his border, then he's not going to go any further. And as I've told you, even if he wanted to go into the West conventionally, he doesn't have the capacity. Flat out, point blank, zero chance that he would roll conventionally into a 32-member NATO alliance. He just doesn't have the ability. So we don't have to worry about that. All we have to do is keep our Article 5 commitments intact, keep the eastern flank of NATO operating like normal, our military operating like normal, our nuclear triad operating like normal. We have nothing to worry about. So all of these fear mongers you keep having saying the opposite, that he's coming for us next, they're liars. I'll just point blank tell you, they're either fools or they're liars. There's only two options, because what they're saying is nowhere close to having any truth to it. It's not. And I just explained to you why that is. Bear that in mind the next time you hear that fake fear mongering, because it's not true. So what we should do then is recognize that truth and say, all right, Ukraine, we're going to help you hold the line you have right here with whatever packages that might take for a fixed period of time. And you have that period of time to make the best deal you can get, the best negotiated settlement. Putin has said that he desires a settlement. He wants one. But the longer you wait, the worse the deal is going to be for Ukraine's side. And if you continue to not accept reality, folks, I think the chances of even getting to 2025 are very low. I think the greater chance is that the further we get into the spring and then into the summer is that the Ukraine army collapses and breaks. And then Russia, which does have a fairly substantial theater reserves, can just pour through the line somewhere. And then everything bad is happening impossible from that point. That's the bigger chance here, is that continuing to ignore reality is going to be even more costly for Ukraine. And then it's going to set off even more alarm bells in the West, and the chance of nuclear confrontation will go even higher than it is right now. Is that in your interest? Is there any interest in the West, in the United States, that is served by elevating the risk of nuclear catastrophe with Russia? I don't have to answer that out loud. It's self-evident. Why is it not self-evident to our leaders? I don't know if they're afraid of the political fallout in an election season. Don't give a crap about any of that. I could care less if they all lose their jobs. They damn well better do what's right and in the interest of the United States. Of course, they may find out, if they do the right thing, that the American people are smarter than what a lot of politicians give them credit for. They see these things even without videos like this. And they may reward any politician who has the courage to do the right thing and to get this word off the table so that we can get on to other things that matter more for our economic and national security interests. That's what we should be doing. But that's what must be done, or folks, one of these days people are going to be watching this video and just shaking their heads and lamenting, and how could our leaders have missed all the signs and led us to disaster and destruction? I pray to God no one ever watches this video on the other side of a disaster and just wonders how people didn't get it back then. I don't know, but I can tell you that that's a risk that it exists right now. And given our current actions of our senior leaders, both in Western Europe and in the United States, that is a growing risk, which I pray to God never happens. That's all we have for you today. But we're going to continue to bring you this kind of information as it develops. We are holding our leaders' feet to the fire. I'm not going to let them get away with those kinds of comments without giving you the context and the truth underneath them. You can count on us here. So like and subscribe. Click on that notification deal so you always get these when they coming out, because we don't want you to miss a single episode. I'm actually going to be live in New York, actually, on Monday next week. I'm going to be on a couple of panels on Fox News with Senator Ernst, KT McFarland, and a former Marine. We're going to be talking about a lot of these issues there in a panel on the Faulkner Focus. You can tune in and watch that on Fox. We're also going to be producing a show at 3 p.m. live from New York on a lot of the things that are happening on the ground in Russia or in the Ukraine or in the Israeli-Hamas war by then. So you'll not want to miss that. That'll be a special treat. We also have Mike Domino, former CIA, and Matthew Ho, former State Department official, also on shows on Tuesday and Thursday. And we always have a lot of good content for you. Keep coming back here, and we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.